1 million. That's roughly how many ancient texts, stories, and religious scriptures from around the world mention a massive flood that once covered the earth. To put that into perspective, it's like every major culture that ever existed independently came up with the exact same story. What could possibly be driving this universal memory of catastrophe? While mainstream history tells us civilization began around 5,000 years ago, the evidence doesn't look like it's supporting that timeline anymore. Since the early 1900s, archaeologists have been finding underwater structures, ancient maps showing coastlines that shouldn't exist, and ruins that predate our supposed first civilizations by thousands of years. This stable narrative is being challenged by discoveries we can't ignore anymore. Researchers need answers, whether you're interested in ancient mysteries, lost history, or just want to understand what really happened before recorded time. The evidence keeps piling up. These discoveries are creating opportunities for us to completely rewrite human history. One of these many findings could change everything we thought we knew about our past. Here's how I know this to be true. For the past decade, archaeologists, geologists, and historians have been uncovering physical evidence of advanced societies that existed before the last ice age ended. The flooding that occurred when these ice sheets melted would have been catastrophic. Sea levels rose by over 400 feet. Coastal civilizations would have been completely wiped out. And if you look at where humans have always built their cities, it's on coastlines and near water sources, which means the most advanced civilizations of the pre-flood world are now under hundreds of feet of ocean water. Before we get into the specific civilizations, you need to completely shift your frame about ancient history. The timeline you learned in school doesn't have to be the final word. Having a rigid view of when civilization started isn't necessarily accurate. In fact, some of the biggest discoveries in archaeology started when researchers questioned the accepted timeline. Traditional story goes like this. Humans were primitive hunter-gatherers until around 4000 BC, when suddenly in Mesopotamia, civilization appeared. Writing, agriculture, cities, and complex society all emerged in what historians call the cradle of civilization. Then Egypt built the pyramids around 2500 BC. Greece and Rome came later. That's the story most people know. But that doesn't mean you can sit comfortably with this narrative and hope that some miracle reveals the truth to you. You need to be intentional about why you're learning this information in the first place. Understanding these lost civilizations could fundamentally change how we view human capability, technological progress, and our own potential. So you must think of this knowledge as an opportunity to understand our true origins rather than a challenge to what you've been taught. Let me show you what I mean. The first civilization we need to talk about existed in a place that's now completely underwater. But before we go there, we need to understand the timeline of the Great Flood itself. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate was very different. We were in the tail end of the last ice age. Massive glaciers covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. These ice sheets were miles thick in some places. Sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today because so much water was locked up in ice. Then something happened. The climate suddenly warmed. This wasn't a gradual process that took thousands of years. Geological evidence shows the warming was rapid and dramatic. Within a few centuries, maybe even faster, global temperatures spiked. The ice sheets began to melt at an alarming rate. As the ice melted, the water had to go somewhere. It flowed into the oceans. Sea levels began to rise. But this wasn't a gentle rising of tides. In some places, the flooding was catastrophic and sudden. Massive ice dams that held back enormous lakes would break, releasing walls of water that would devastate everything in their path. The rising sea levels would have been devastating for coastal populations. Imagine you're living in a thriving city on the coast. Your civilization has been there for thousands of years. You have agriculture, buildings, perhaps even early forms of writing and technology. Then, over the course of a few generations, the ocean starts creeping closer. First, it's just the lowest areas that flood during storms. Then entire neighborhoods are underwater. Then the whole city. People would have been forced to move inland, abandoning everything they built. This flooding continued for thousands of years as the ice sheets. By around 8,000 years ago, sea levels had risen to approximately where they are today. All the coastal areas that were once dry land were now deep underwater. Any civilizations that existed in those areas would have been completely lost to the ocean. Now, here's what makes this relevant. Humans have always preferred to live near water. Rivers, lakes, and coastlines are where civilizations naturally develop. You need water for drinking, agriculture, transportation, and trade. Look at every major ancient civilization we know about. Egypt along the Nile, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Indus Valley civilization along the Indus River, China along the Yellow River, all near water. So, if there were advanced civilizations before the flood, they would have been built in the areas that are now underwater. The places where we would find the best evidence of pre-flood civilization are exactly the places we can't easily access because they're under hundreds of feet of ocean water. But some evidence has survived, and that's what we're going to explore now. The first lost civilization we need to talk about existed in a place called Sundaland. You won't find Sundaland on any modern map because it doesn't exist anymore. It's underwater. But for thousands of years before the flood, it was one of the largest landmasses on Earth. Today, if you look at Southeast Asia, you'll see Indonesia, Malaysia, and thousands of islands scattered across the ocean. But during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, all of these islands were connected by land. The entire region from mainland Southeast Asia down to Indonesia and over to the Philippines was one massive continent. Scientists call this Sundaland. Sundaland was huge. It covered an area of about 700,000 square miles. That's roughly twice the size of modern India. It would have had diverse climates, from tropical rainforests to grasslands. Rivers would have crisscrossed the landscape. The conditions would have been perfect for human civilization to develop. And we know humans were there. Archaeological evidence shows that modern humans reached Southeast Asia at least 50,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived on Sundaland while it was dry land. They would have had plenty of time to develop sophisticated cultures and societies. So what happened to Sundaland? When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, the ocean slowly swallowed it. Because the land was relatively flat and low-lying, even small rises in sea level would have flooded enormous areas. Over the course of several thousand years, this vast continent was broken up into the islands we see today. Millions of square miles of land simply disappeared under the ocean. Now here's what's fascinating. The flooding of Sundaland coincides almost perfectly with flood myths from cultures all around the region. Indigenous peoples in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and even Australia all have ancient stories of a great flood that destroyed the land. These aren't just random myths. They're remarkably consistent in describing rising waters that forced people to flee to higher ground. But we don't just have myths. We have physical evidence too. In recent decades, underwater surveys have discovered what appear to be man-made structures off the coasts of India, Indonesia, and other areas that would have been part of Sundaland. Some of these structures are in water hundreds of feet deep, meaning they've been submerged for thousands of years. One of the most intriguing discoveries was made off the coast of India near the city of Mahabalipuram. Local legends had always spoken of 7 temples that once stood on the shore, but 6 of them were swallowed by the sea. Most historians dismiss these as myths. Then in 2002, after a tsunami disturbed the seafloor, divers found massive stone structures underwater. These weren't natural formations. They were walls, steps, and carved blocks arranged in patterns. Carbon dating of materials found at the site suggests that the structures were at least 6,000 years old, possibly much older. Similar discoveries have been made in the waters around Indonesia. Sonar imaging has revealed what appear to be pyramidal structures on the ocean floor. Some researchers believe these could be evidence of advanced building techniques from a time before the flooding. What makes Sundaland particularly important is its size and location. This wasn't some small settlement. It was a continent-sized landmass with the potential to support a large, advanced civilization, and its location in Southeast Asia would have made it a natural hub for trade and cultural exchange between Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Think about what a civilization on Sundaland could have achieved. They would have had thousands of years of stability and development. They would have had access to diverse resources from different climate zones. They would have been positioned at a crossroads of human migration routes. It's entirely possible that Sundaland was home to one of the most advanced and influential civilizations of the pre-flood world. But when the flood came, nearly all evidence of this civilization would have been lost. The rising waters didn't just cover the land. The ocean currents, storms, and sediment would have destroyed or buried most structures. After 10,000 years underwater, Even stone buildings would be difficult to distinguish from natural rock formations. Yet the evidence we have found suggests that Sundaland was more than just empty land. It was home to people who built, created, and developed their own unique culture, and when their world flooded, the survivors would have carried memories of their lost homeland with them, preserving them in the flood myths that persist to this day. Now we move from Southeast Asia to Europe, where another massive landmass disappeared beneath the waves. This one is called Doggerland, and it connected Britain to mainland Europe for thousands of years before them. Today, if you want to travel from England to France, you either take a plane, a ferry across the English Channel, or the tunnel that runs under the water. But during the Ice Age, you could have walked from Britain to Europe across dry land. The entire southern portion of what is now the North Sea was above water. This region, which scientists call Doggerland, was home to human populations for thousands of years. Doggerland covered an area of roughly 100,000 square miles. It stretched from what is now the east coast of Britain across to the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. At its peak, it would have been a rich, fertile plain with rivers, lakes, marshes, and forests. The climate would have been moderate, making it an ideal place for human habitation. We know people lived in Doggerland because we keep finding their artifacts. Over the years, fishing boats operating in the North Sea have dragged up thousands of prehistoric tools and weapons in their nets. Stone axes, spear points, and other implements made by humans have been recovered from the seafloor. These artifacts are often found alongside bones of animals that lived on land, like mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, and deer. This tells us that what is now ocean was once dry hunting ground. But the most compelling evidence comes from modern technology. In recent years, scientists have used advanced sonar mapping to create detailed pictures of the North Sea floor. What they found was astonishing. Beneath the water, they discovered the remains of an ancient landscape. They could see river valleys, hills, and what appeared to be a massive river system that would have been one of the largest in Europe. This wasn't just empty wilderness. The landscape had all the features you would associate with human settlement. There were areas that would have been perfect for farming, river junctions where you would expect to find villages, elevated areas that would have been natural defensive positions for settlements. Everything about the geography suggests that Doggerland could have supported a significant human population. So what happened? Why is Doggerland now underwater? The answer is the same as Sundaland. The ice melted and sea levels rose. But Doggerland had an additional catastrophe. Around 8,200 years ago, something happened that accelerated the flooding dramatically. In what is now Norway, there was a massive underwater landslide. An enormous section of the continental shelf collapsed and slid into the ocean. The geological evidence for this event, called the Storegga slide, is undeniable. When this much material suddenly displaces that much water, it creates a tsunami. The tsunami that resulted from the Storegga slide would have been devastating. Computer models suggest waves up to 80 feet high hit the coast of Doggerland. Any settlements in low-lying areas would have been instantly destroyed. Thousands of people would have died. And the flooding didn't stop with the tsunami. The event seems to have triggered accelerated sea level rise that finished the job of submerging Doggerland. Within a few centuries, the entire region was underwater. Britain became an island. The people who had lived in Doggerland either drowned or fled to higher ground in what is now Britain and continental Europe. Now here's what makes this relevant for our purposes. Doggerland existed right up until the dawn of recorded history. The final flooding of Doggerland happened around 8,000 years. That's only 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramids were built. In historical terms, that's recent. The people who witnessed the destruction of Doggerland were not primitive cavemen. They were modern humans with the same intelligence and capabilities as us, and they had a long history in that region. Humans had been living in Doggerland for at least 10,000 years before it flooded. It's 10,000 years to develop culture, technology, and social organization. That's longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. What could a people accomplish in 10,000 years? We went from the first cities to landing on the moon in less than 6,000 years. Yet we're supposed to believe the people of Doggerland never advanced beyond simple hunter-gatherer lifestyle? That seems unlikely. Unfortunately, because Doggerland is now underwater and covered in sediment, we can't easily investigate what might be down there.
The few artifacts we have are ones that happen to get snagged in fishing nets. There could be entire settlements, sophisticated tools, even early forms of writing or art lying on the sea floor, and we would never know unless we specifically went looking for them. But the flood myths of Northern Europe give us hints. The Norse legends speak of a great flood that reshaped the world. Celtic traditions from Britain and Ireland describe lands that sank beneath the waves. These stories are consistent with the geological evidence of Doggerland's destruction. The people of Doggerland were real. Their civilization, whatever form it took, was real, and it was destroyed by the rising waters of the post-Ice Age flood. The survivors would have carried the memory of their lost homeland with them, preserving it in stories passed down through generations. From the North Sea, we move to the Black Sea, where one of the most dramatic flooding events in human history occurred. This event was so catastrophic that many researchers believe it's the origin of the Noah's Ark flood story and similar flood myths from the region. Today, the Black Sea is a large body of water surrounded by Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Georgia. It's connected to the Mediterranean Sea by a narrow strait called the Bosphorus, but during the Ice Age, the Black Sea was very different. It wasn't connected to the Mediterranean, it was a freshwater lake, much smaller than the current sea, sitting well below global sea level. The land around this ancient Black Sea lake was fertile and well watered. It would have been an ideal location for early farming communities. Archaeological evidence confirms that humans were indeed living around the shores of this lake thousands of years ago. Then disaster struck. Around 7,600 years ago, something happened that changed the Black Sea forever. The rising sea levels from the melting ice sheets had been filling the Mediterranean Sea. Eventually, the water level in the Mediterranean rose high enough to breach the natural dam of land that separated it from the Black Sea lake. When the breach happened, it was catastrophic. The Mediterranean Sea poured into the Black Sea basin through what is now the Bosphorus Strait. But this wasn't a gentle filling. It was a massive waterfall, possibly one of the largest waterfalls that has ever existed on Earth. Scientists estimate that water poured through the breach at a rate of about 10 cubic miles per day. It's roughly 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls. This continued for months, possibly even years. The noise would have been deafening, heard for miles around. The spray and mist would have been visible from enormous distances. For the people living around the shores of the Black Sea Lake, this would have been apocalyptic. The water level rose rapidly, possibly as much as several inches per day. Day after day, the waterline would advance further inland. Villages would be flooded and abandoned. Farmland would be submerged. People would have been forced to flee inland, constantly moving to stay ahead of the rising water. Flooding continued until the Black Sea basin was completely filled and connected to the Mediterranean. By the time it was over, the water level had risen by more than 500 feet. The shoreline had moved dramatically inland. Hundreds of square miles of land were now deep underwater. The freshwater lake had become a saltwater sea. The entire ecology of the region changed. The evidence for this catastrophic flooding is overwhelming. Geological surveys of the Black Sea floor have found the ancient shoreline of the pre-flood lake, now deep underwater. They found layers of sediment that show rapid deposition consistent with massive flooding. They've even found what appear to be preserved remains of the landscape that was flooded, including river valleys and beaches. But the most compelling evidence comes from biology. When researchers studied the water and sediments of the Black Sea, they found a clear boundary layer. Below a certain depth, the sediments contain freshwater organisms. Above that depth, everything is saltwater organisms, and the transition is sharp, not gradual. This is exactly what you would expect if a freshwater lake suddenly became a saltwater sea. Now here's where it gets interesting for our story of lost civilizations. Who was living around the Black Sea when this happened? We know from archaeological evidence that there were human settlements in the region. These weren't primitive nomads. By 7,600 years ago, humans in this area had developed agriculture. They were farming wheat and barley, raising cattle and sheep, living in permanent villages. When the flood came, these communities would have been destroyed. Most of the settlements would now be deep underwater. Any survivors would have fled inland, taking only what they could carry. They would have lost everything except their memories of what happened. and they would have passed those memories down to their children and grandchildren. The story of a great flood that destroyed the world would have become part of their cultural identity. As these people and their descendants spread out across the region, they would have carried this story with them. This is why flood myths are so prevalent in the civilizations that later emerged around the Mediterranean and Middle East. The Sumerians had their flood story, the Babylonians had theirs. The ancient Hebrews recorded the story of Noah. The ancient Greeks had the story of Deucalion's flood. All of these stories describe a catastrophic flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, with only a few righteous people surviving by building a boat. The details vary, but the core story is consistent, and it matches almost perfectly with the geological evidence of the Black Sea deluge. A massive flood that raised water levels hundreds of feet, communities destroyed and forced to flee, a dramatic reshaping of the landscape that would have seemed like the end of the world to those who experienced it. But beyond just explaining the origin of flood myths, the Black Sea deluge represents the loss of what could have been a significant early civilization. The people living around the Black Sea before the flood had agriculture, permanent settlements, and likely complex social organization. They were not primitive. They were on the path to becoming a full civilization. If the flood hadn't happened, what might they have achieved? We'll never know, because their settlements are now deep underwater, buried under thousands of years of sediment. Any evidence of their accomplishments is lost. We can only glimpse them through the few artifacts that have been found and the stories they left behind. Now we travel to India, where one of the most impressive underwater archaeological discoveries has been made. This one is different from the others because we're not just talking about a lost region or a theoretical civilization. We have an actual city that we can see underwater, called Dwarka, and its existence was considered just a myth until divers found it. In Hindu scripture, particularly the Mahabharata and other ancient texts, there are descriptions of a magnificent city called Dwarka. According to these stories, Dwarka was the dwelling place of Lord Krishna, one of the most important deities in Hinduism. The ancient texts describe Dwarka as a planned city with a grid layout, multiple harbors, strong walls, and beautiful buildings. It was said to be incredibly advanced for its time. The texts also describe how Dwarka was eventually destroyed and swallowed by the ocean. For centuries, scholars assumed this was just religious mythology. Descriptions of Dwarka seemed too advanced to be real, and if there had been such a city, where was it? No ruins of Dwarka had ever been found on land. Then, in the 1980s, marine archaeologists decided to search the waters off the coast of Gujarat in western India, near the modern town of Dwarka. What they found was astonishing. Beneath the water, they discovered massive stone structures. These weren't natural formations. They were clearly made by humans. There were walls, foundations, pillars, and what appeared to be streets laid out in a grid pattern. The structures were made of large blocks of stone, precisely cut and fitted together. Some of the blocks weighed several tons. The discovery caused a sensation in India and among archaeologists worldwide. Here was physical proof that the legendary city of Dwarka had actually existed. It wasn't just mythology, it was history. Further excavations revealed more details. The underwater city covered a significant area. There were multiple structures suggesting this was a major settlement. Pottery and other artifacts were recovered and dated. Some of the materials dated back more than 9,000 years. That would make Dwarka older than the pyramids of Egypt by thousands of years. But perhaps the most impressive feature was the engineering. The stone blocks used in the construction were extremely well cut. The walls were straight and sturdy. Layout showed evidence of urban planning. This wasn't a primitive village. This was an organized city built by people who understood architecture and engineering. How did such an advanced city end up underwater? The same way as all the others on our list. Rising sea levels from the post-Ice Age flooding. The city would have originally been built on the coast or slightly inland. As sea levels rose over thousands of years, the ocean gradually encroached on the city. Eventually, the entire settlement was submerged. What makes Dwarka particularly important is that it validates the ancient texts. For years, scholars had dismissed ancient Indian scriptures as pure mythology with no historical basis. The descriptions of advanced ancient cities seemed impossible. But Dwarka proves that these texts were preserving real historical memories, passed down through oral tradition and eventually written down. If the descriptions of Dwarka in the ancient texts are accurate, and we now know they are based on a real city, what about the other details in those texts? The Mahabharata and other Indian scriptures describe flying machines, advanced weapons, and other technologies that sound impossible for ancient people. Could some of these descriptions also be based on real technologies that existed in the pre-flood world? Most mainstream archaeologists say no. They argue that the technological descriptions are poetic exaggeration or metaphor, but the discovery of underwater Dwarka should make us more cautious about dismissing ancient texts too quickly. People who preserved these stories were describing real places and real events. Maybe they were also describing real technologies that we haven't found evidence for yet. Dwarka also raises questions about how many other underwater cities are out there waiting to be discovered. India has thousands of miles of coastline. If one legendary city turned out to be real and underwater, how many others might there be? And it's not just India. Every coastal region in the world that was inhabited before the flood could potentially have underwater ruins. The problem is that finding and excavating underwater archaeological sites is extremely difficult and expensive. The water is often murky, making visibility poor. Ocean currents disturb the sites and bury them under sediment, and diving to depths of 100 feet or more requires specialized equipment and training. For these reasons, only a tiny fraction of the world's coastal waters have been surveyed for underwater ruins. But what we have found is remarkable. Dwarka stands as proof that advanced civilizations existed before the flood, and that their cities are now underwater, waiting to be rediscovered. We now travel to Japan, where one of the most controversial underwater discoveries has sparked decades of debate. Off the coast of Yonaguni Island, the southernmost island in Japan, divers have found a massive underwater structure that looks like a stepped pyramid. The question that divides researchers is simple but profound. Is it natural or man-made? The Yonaguni Monument, as it's called, was discovered in 1987 by a local dive operator. He was searching for good spots to see hammerhead sharks when he came across something strange on the ocean floor. Rising from the depths was a massive structure with flat surfaces, sharp angles, and what appeared to be steps carved into the rock. The structure is enormous. Main formation is about 150 feet long and 90 feet wide, rising about 80 feet from the seafloor to within about 16 feet of the surface. It has multiple terraces connected by steps. There are flat platforms, vertical walls, and what look like roads or paths. Some sections have holes or recesses that appear deliberately carved. When news of the discovery spread, archaeologists and geologists flocked to investigate. What they found only deepened the mystery. The structure is made of sandstone and mudstone, types of rock that are common in the area. The shapes and patterns are unusual. Rock naturally fractures and erodes in certain ways, but the Yonaguni Monument doesn't quite fit those patterns. The main argument in favor of it being natural is that sandstone can fracture along straight lines, creating formations that look artificial. Nature can create terraces through erosion. So it's possible, though unusual, for natural processes to create something like this. But the argument in favor of it being man-made is compelling too. The steps are remarkably regular and uniform. The flat platforms are extremely flat, more than you would typically expect from natural erosion. There are features that look like walls, roads, and even what might be carved faces or symbols. Some of the angles and shapes are difficult to explain through natural processes, and the most intriguing features are the ones that look obviously artificial. There's a section that looks like a carved face or head. There are holes drilled into the rock in patterns that seem intentional. There's what appears to be a road or path with walls on either side. These features are hard to explain away as natural formations. One Japanese geologist who has studied the site extensively believes it's partly natural and partly modified by humans. It suggests that ancient people found a naturally terraced rock formation and enhanced it, carving additional features and creating steps and platforms. This would explain why some features look natural while others look artificial. Carbon dating can't be used on rock, so determining the age of the structure is difficult. But by measuring the rate at which the rock has been covered by coral and other marine growth, researchers estimate the structure has been underwater for at least 10,000 years. That would place its construction, if it is man-made, firmly in the pre-flood era. So let's assume for a moment that the Yonaguni monument is at least partially man-made. What does that tell us? It means that 10,000 or more years ago, there was a civilization in this region capable of massive stone construction. They were quarrying and shaping stone blocks weighing many tons. They were creating structures with complex geometry and planning. They were doing this thousands of years before we think civilization began. The people who built it would have been living on what was then dry land or shallow coastal areas. As sea levels rose, their structures would have been gradually submerged. The civilization that created them would have either adapted and moved inland, or they would have been destroyed by the flooding. What's particularly interesting is Yonaguni's location. It sits at the southern end of Japan, near Taiwan. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, this entire region would have been connected. Taiwan wasn't an island, but part of mainland Asia. You could have walked from Japan to China across dry land. This would have been a natural area for human settlement and the development of civilization. And that brings us back to the bigger picture. If the Yonaguni monument is man-made, it's not evidence of an isolated group of ancient people doing something strange. It's evidence of a broader civilization that existed throughout this region before the flood. A civilization that was capable of large-scale stone construction and had the social organization to mobilize the labor needed for such projects. The mainstream archaeological community remains skeptical. Most argue the formation is natural, but even the skeptics acknowledge that more research is needed. The site has not been fully excavated or explored. There could be more evidence buried under sediment or hidden in unexplored sections of the structure. For now, the Yonaguni monument remains one of the most intriguing mysteries in underwater archaeology. Whether fully natural, partly modified, or entirely man-made, it forces us to reconsider what we know about the human past in this region. And it reminds us that the ocean is hiding evidence of our history that we're only beginning to uncover. Now we move from underwater sites to one that's on dry land, but is just as revolutionary for understanding pre-flood civilizations. Gobekli Tepe in Turkey is not underwater, but it dates from the same era as the flooding events we've been discussing, and its existence challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient humans. Gobekli Tepe is located in southeastern Turkey, on a hilltop overlooking the plains. For thousands of years, locals knew there was something on that hill because carved stones occasionally appeared. But they assumed it was just an old cemetery or minor site. It wasn't until the 1990s that archaeologists began serious excavations and realized what they had found. What they discovered shocked the archaeological world. Gobekli Tepe is a massive complex of stone structures dating back 11,600 years. That makes it older than Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. It's older than the pyramids by more than 7,000 years. It's older than the invention of agriculture, writing, pottery, and everything else we associate with civilization. Structures at Gobekli Tepe are impressive. The site consists of multiple circular compounds made of massive T-shaped stone pillars. These pillars are enormous, some weighing up to 20 tons and standing 16 feet tall. They're precisely carved with images of animals, geometric patterns, and abstract symbols. Foxes, lions, bulls, scorpions, birds, and snakes are depicted in remarkable detail. The pillars are arranged in circles with two larger pillars in the center of each circle. The whole thing was clearly planned and built according to a specific design. This wasn't random. It required architectural knowledge, labor organization, and a shared purpose that brought people together. Here's why this is so important. Gobekli Tepe completely overturns our understanding of human development. The traditional model says that humans first developed agriculture, which led to permanent settlements, which led to surplus food, which gave people free time, which allowed them to develop art, religion, and monumental architecture. But Gobekli Tepe was built before agriculture. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. They didn't have farms or domesticated animals. They hunted wild game and gathered wild plants. Yet somehow these supposedly primitive people organized themselves to quarry massive stones, transport them to the hilltop, carve intricate designs into them, direct them in complex patterns. This requires us to completely rethink our assumptions. If hunter-gatherers could build Gobekli Tepe, what else were they capable of? And if they could do this 11,600 years ago, what might humans have accomplished even earlier, during the tens of thousands of years before that? Some researchers believe Gobekli Tepe was a religious site, possibly one of the world's first temples. The arrangement of the stones suggests it was a place for gatherings, perhaps for seasonal ceremonies or rituals. The animal carvings might represent clans or totems. The abstract symbols might be early forms of writing or record-keeping. But others point out that we don't really know what Gobekli Tepe was for. Our understanding of the people who built it is extremely limited. We're imposing our assumptions about religion and ceremony onto people who lived nearly 12,000 years ago. They might have had completely different ways of thinking about the world. What we do know is that the people who built Gobekli Tepe were sophisticated and capable. They had the technical skills to work stone, the organizational skills to coordinate large construction projects, and the artistic skills to create beautiful carvings. They were not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. And here's the connection to our story of lost civilizations and the flood. Gobekli Tepe was built right around the time when the worst of the post-Ice Age flooding was occurring. Sea levels were rising dramatically. Coastal regions were being inundated. The climate was changing rapidly. It was a time of crisis and upheaval. Some researchers have suggested that Gobekli Tepe might have been built by refugees from coastal regions that were being flooded. Perhaps the people who built it were survivors of lost coastal civilizations, and they brought their knowledge and skills inland with them. When their old world was destroyed by rising seas, they created this monument in their new home. We can't prove this theory, but it's intriguing. It would explain why Gobekli Tepe appears seemingly out of nowhere, with no earlier examples of similar architecture. It would explain why the builders had such advanced skills despite being nominally hunter-gatherers. And it would connect Gobekli Tepe to the broader story of pre-flood civilizations. Even more intriguing is what happened to Gobekli Tepe. Around 10,000 years ago, after being used for over 1,000 years, the site was deliberately buried. The people who used it filled in all the structures with dirt and rubble, completely covering them. Then they apparently abandoned the site. Why would anyone bury such a magnificent complex? We don't know. Some think it was to preserve it. Others think the purpose of the site had been fulfilled. Still others wonder if there was some kind of disaster or cultural change that led to its abandonment. But the burial preserved Gobekli Tepe perfect. When archaeologists excavated it, they found the structures almost exactly as they had been left. And that's why we can study them today and be amazed by what humans accomplished so long ago. The other important point is that Gobekli Tepe is not unique. Since its discovery, archaeologists have found several other similar sites in the same region of Turkey, all dating from around the same period. This suggests there was a whole culture of people in this area building these kinds of structures 11,000 to 12,000 years ago. Sophisticated stone structures were being built inland in Turkey during this period. What were people building on the coasts before the flooding? We may never know because those sites are now underwater, but Gobekli Tepe gives us a glimpse of what was possible. It proves that humans in the pre-flood era were capable of far more than we usually give them credit for. We now travel to the Pacific Ocean, to a remote group of islands called Micronesia. Here on the island of Pohnpei sits one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the world. It's called Nan Madol, and it's often described as the Venice of the Pacific because it was built on a series of artificial islands in a lagoon. Nan Madol is a complex of nearly 100 artificial islets built on a coral reef flat. These islets are connected by a network of canals, hence the comparison to Venice. Structures on these islands are made of massive basalt columns stacked in crisscrossing patterns to form walls and platforms. Some of the basalt logs used in construction weigh up to 50 tons. The engineering required to build Nan Madol is staggering. The builders had to quarry the basalt from a site on the main island, transport these enormous logs across the water, and then stack them to create walls up to 50 feet high. All of this was done without metal tools, without wheels, and without any of the machinery we would consider necessary for such a project. The official dating of Nan Madol places its construction between 1200 and 1500 years ago. This makes it much more recent than the other sites we've been discussing. But here's where it gets interesting. Local legends tell a very different story. According to the oral traditions of Pompeii, Nan Madol is much, much older. The legends speak of a lost civilization that built Nan Madol using magic to make the massive stones fly through the air. The stories describe twin sorcerers who levitated the basalt columns and placed them in position without physical effort. Now, obviously, we should be skeptical of claims about magic and levitation. But what if these stories are describing technologies that were so advanced they seemed like magic to later people who didn't understand them? What if the original builders of Nan Madol had engineering techniques that were lost over time, making their accomplishments seem impossible? This is where the connection to pre-flood civilizations comes in. Some researchers have suggested that the official dating of Nan Madol might be wrong, or at least incomplete, point to evidence that the site might have been built in phases, with the oldest parts being much more ancient than currently believed. For one thing, the basalt columns used in construction are worn and weathered in ways that suggest great age. The coral growth on some of the underwater structures is thicker than you would expect for something only 1,200 years old. And the level of engineering sophistication required to build Nan Madol seems inconsistent with what we know about Pacific Island cultures of 1,200 years ago. Some researchers have suggested that Nan Madol might have been built on the ruins of an even older site, one that dates back to the pre-flood era when sea levels were lower. The current structures might be the most recent phase of construction on a site that has been used for thousands of years. This theory gains some support from the fact that there are underwater structures around Nan Madol. Divers have found what appear to be stone columns and other ruins in the water surrounding the artificial islands. These underwater structures are at depths that suggest they've been submerged for a very long time, possibly thousands of years. If Nan Madol, or an earlier version of it, dates back to the pre-flood era, it would have interesting implications. It would suggest that there was a sophisticated Pacific Island civilization capable of megalithic stone construction long before we think such civilizations existed. And it would suggest that this civilization had knowledge of engineering and architecture that was later lost or forgotten. The mystery of how Nan Madol was built remains unsolved. Moving 50-ton stones without modern equipment is difficult to explain. Various theories have been proposed using rafts to float the stones, using leverage and inclined planes to move them, building temporary structures to support them during construction. None of these theories have been proven, and experts admit they're not entirely sure how it was done. What we do know is that Nan Madol represents an extraordinary achievement in engineering and construction. The people who built it, whenever they built it, were highly skilled and organized. They understood structural engineering well enough to create walls that have stood for centuries despite typhoons, earthquakes, and the corrosive effects of the tropical climate. And the sheer audacity of building an entire city on artificial islands in a lagoon speaks to a level of confidence and capability that challenges our assumptions about ancient people. This wasn't a simple village. This was an ambitious urban project that required planning, resources, and technical expertise. Whether Nan Madol is 1,200 years old as officially dated, or much older as local legends suggest, it stands as a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. And it reminds us that even in the remote Pacific, far from the civilizations we usually think of as ancient and advanced, people were accomplishing remarkable things. Now we need to talk about two controversial ideas that have captured imaginations for over a century. These are the proposed lost continents of Moor and Lemuria, supposedly once located in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Unlike the other civilizations we've discussed, these are more theoretical and controversial. But they're worth examining because they've influenced how people think about lost pre-flood civilizations. The idea of Lemuria came first. In the mid-1800s, scientists at that time were puzzled by a zoological mystery. Lemurs, a type of primate, are found in Madagascar off the coast of Africa, in India, and in Southeast Asia, but nowhere in between. How did they end up in these widely separated locations? One British zoologist proposed a solution. Maybe there used to be a land bridge connecting these areas, allowing lemurs to spread across a now vanished continent. He called this hypothetical landmass Lemuria. The idea made sense given the knowledge of the time, before we understood plate tectonics and continental drift. Later, in the early 1900s, a writer named James Churchward expanded on these ideas and proposed the lost continent of Mu. According to Churchward, Mu was a vast continent in the Pacific Ocean that was home to an advanced civilization. He claimed it was the original home of humanity, and that all other civilizations were colonies of Mu. He said Mu sank beneath the waves about 12,000 years ago in a catastrophic destruction. Now, here's the problem. Modern geology has thoroughly disproven the possibility of large continents sinking in the Pacific or Indian Oceans.
The ocean floor in these regions is fundamentally different from continental crust. It's not possible for a continent-sized landmass to simply sink without leaving massive geological evidence that we would easily detect. So Lemuria and Mu, as described in these old theories, definitely didn't exist. But that doesn't mean the ideas are entirely without merit. Here's why they're still relevant to our discussion. First, while large continents didn't exist in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, there absolutely were large areas of land that are now underwater. We already talked about Sundaland in Southeast Asia. There were similar landmasses in other areas. During the Ice Age, many islands in the Pacific were much larger or connected to each other. Papua New Guinea and Australia were connected as one landmass. Thousands of square miles of land that are now underwater were above sea level. Second, the widespread distribution of similar cultural elements across Pacific islands is real and still not fully explained. Stone monuments, similar mythologies, and comparable cultural practices are found across islands separated by thousands of miles of ocean. How did these cultures share so many similarities? The old theories of Lemuria and Mu tried to explain this by proposing a central motherland from which all Pacific cultures originated. While the specific mechanism they proposed was wrong, the underlying question remains valid. Was there a more connected Pacific world before the flooding, with more land above water and more opportunities for cultural exchange and development? Third, oral traditions from Pacific Island cultures often speak of homelands that sank beneath the sea. Hawaiian traditions speak of a lost land called Kainhunamoku. Polynesian legends describe lands that were swallowed by the ocean. These stories are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other for thousands of years. Are these stories memories of actual places that were flooded when sea levels rose, or are they just myths? Given what we now know about the extent of post-Ice Age flooding, it seems likely that at least some of these stories are based on real events. People witnessed their lands being flooded and passed down stories about it. So while we can't support the idea of Lemuria or Mu as massive continents that sank, we can acknowledge that, 1, there were significant land masses in the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions that are now underwater. 2, these lands could have supported human populations and potentially sophisticated cultures. 3, when these lands were gradually submerged over thousands of years, the survivors would have carried memories of their lost homelands with them. The modern version of these theories doesn't require magical continents or impossible geology. It simply requires accepting that there was more habitable land in these regions before the flood. The humans living there might have developed advanced cultures whose remains are now underwater. Research continues in these regions. Underwater archaeological surveys are finding interesting structures off the coasts of various Pacific islands. Some appear to be natural, but others are harder to explain. As technology improves and more of the ocean floor is surveyed, we may discover evidence of human habitation in areas that are now deep underwater. The legends of Mu and Lemuria, while scientifically inaccurate in their original form, served an important purpose. They kept alive the idea that there might be lost civilizations in our past, encouraged people to question the standard narrative and look for evidence of ancient peoples. And in a way, they predicted what we're now discovering, that the pre-flood world was more complex and sophisticated than traditional archaeology has acknowledged. No discussion of lost pre-flood civilizations would be complete without talking about Atlantis. It's the most famous lost civilization in history, mentioned in countless books, movies, and TV shows. But separating facts from fiction when it comes to Atlantis is nearly impossible, because the story has been retold and embellished so many times. The original source for the Atlantis story is the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Around 360 BC, Plato wrote 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, in which he described Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful island nation that existed 9,000 years before his time. Would place Atlantis around 9,600 BC, right in the middle of the post-Ice Age period we've been discussing. Plato described Atlantis as a large island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. He said it was larger than Libya and Asia combined, though this was probably an exaggeration or mistranslation. The island was home to a powerful and advanced civilization with a strong navy, beautiful architecture, and sophisticated engineering. According to Plato, Atlantis had a complex series of concentric rings of land and water surrounding the central city. They had advanced irrigation, beautiful temples, and enormous wealth. The Atlanteans were initially noble and just, but they gradually became corrupt and aggressive, eventually trying to conquer other lands. The gods, angered by Atlantis' corruption, decided to punish. In a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the waves and vanished forever. The sea above it became unnavigable due to shoals of mud. That's Plato's story. Now, the question that has fascinated people for over 2,000 years is, was Plato describing a real place, or was he making up a story to illustrate philosophical points? Most ancient Greek philosophers who came after Plato thought he was being literal in describing a real place. Aristotle, Plato's student, thought it was made up. The debate has continued ever since. Modern scholars are divided. Many think Atlantis was purely fictional, a thought experiment Plato used to explore ideas about ideal societies and what causes civilizations to fail. They point out that the details of the story fit a little too perfectly with Plato's philosophical arguments, suggesting he constructed the story to make his points. But others think there might be a grain of truth behind the story. They suggest Plato might have been writing about a real disaster that happened long before his time, preserving an ancient memory of a civilization that was destroyed by natural catastrophe. If Atlantis was real, where was it? Over the centuries, dozens of locations have been proposed. Some say it was in the Atlantic Ocean, now completely submerged. Others place it in the Mediterranean, perhaps on the island of Santorini, which was partially destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption around 1600 BC. Some think it was in the Americas. Others place it near Antarctica, or in the Caribbean, or off the coast of Spain, or in the Black Sea. The problem is that none of these theories have been proven. No one has found ruins that definitively match Plato's description of Atlantis. And the truth is, Plato's description is vague enough. You could probably fit it to dozens of different locations if you were creative enough with your interpretation. But here's what's interesting. Even if the specific story of Atlantis as Plato told it is fictional, it might still be based on real events. Plato lived thousands of years after the major post-Ice Age flooding events. But Greek culture had a strong oral tradition. Stories were passed down through generations. It's entirely possible that somewhere in the chain of stories that led to Plato's account, there were memories of real places that were destroyed by real catastrophes. Remember the Black Sea deluge we discussed earlier? That happened around 5400 BC, which is about 5,000 years before Plato wrote about Atlantis. Communities around the Black Sea really were destroyed by catastrophic. Survivors really did flee and spread across the region, carrying stories of the disaster with them. Those stories could have been passed down through generations, gradually transforming and being embellished until they became the story Plato recorded. Or consider the volcanic eruption that destroyed much of the island of Santorini around 1600 BC. This was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. It caused tsunamis that devastated coastal areas throughout the Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization on Crete was severely damaged and never fully. This was a catastrophe that people would have remembered and told stories about for generations. So while we can't prove that Atlantis as described by Plato actually existed, we can say that the idea of advanced civilizations being destroyed by natural disasters is not fantastical. It really happened multiple times in various places around the world. The enduring appeal of the Atlantis story is that it taps into something deep in human consciousness. We have an intuition that there's more to our past than the official history tells us. We suspect that ancient peoples might have been more capable and sophisticated than we usually assume, and we're drawn to the tragic idea of great civilizations being lost to disaster. In a way, every underwater ruin, every flooded coastline, every ancient structure that predates the supposed beginning of civilization is a piece of Atlantis. Not one specific place, but the collective lost world of the pre-flood era. A world that was more advanced, more widespread, and more interesting than traditional archaeology has acknowledged. A world that was destroyed when the ice melted and the seas rose, leaving only fragments and memories behind. We've now looked at 10 different civilizations or potential civilizations that existed before or during the Great Post-Ice Age flooding, from Sundaland to Doggerland, from the Black Sea deluge to underwater cities like Dwarka and possible structures like Yonaguni. We've examined Gobekli Tepe, which proves ancient people were more capable than we thought. We've discussed Nanmadol and the legends of Pacific wastelands, and we've explored the enduring mystery of Atlantis. So what does all of this mean? Why does it matter if there were advanced civilizations before the flood? It matters because it changes how we understand ourselves. The standard story of human civilization is that we were primitive for hundreds of thousands of years, and then suddenly, about 6,000 years ago, we figured out how to build cities and create complex societies. Everything important happened in the last few thousand years. Before that, humans were just simple hunter-gatherers without significant culture or technology. But this story is being challenged by the evidence. Gobekli Tepe alone proves that supposed hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago were capable of sophisticated architecture and engineering. The underwater ruins around the world suggest that there were settlements and possibly cities in coastal areas that are now submerged. The widespread flood myths indicate that people witnessed and remembered the catastrophic flooding events. When you put all of this evidence together, a different picture emerges. Instead of civilization beginning suddenly 6,000 years ago, it seems more likely that humans have been developing sophisticated cultures for much longer. There may have been multiple rises and falls of civilization, with the post-Ice Age flooding representing a major reset button that destroyed many coastal civilizations and forced humanity to rebuild. This matters for several reasons. First, it means we should be more humble about what we think we know about the past. For centuries, we've been dismissing ancient myths and legends as primitive superstition, but those stories might be preserving real historical memories that we should be taking seriously. Second, it suggests that ancient people were just as intelligent and capable as we are. They didn't have our technology, but they were innovating and problem-solving just as we do. The idea that people only got smart recently is both arrogant and wrong. Third, it raises the possibility that important knowledge was lost during the flooding. If there were advanced civilizations before the flood, they might have had technologies, agricultural techniques, astronomical knowledge, or other capabilities that were lost when their cities were destroyed. We might be rediscovering things that were already known thousands of years ago. Fourth, it emphasizes how vulnerable coastal civilizations are to climate change and rising sea levels. The flooding that destroyed these ancient civilizations happened gradually over thousands of years, but from the perspective of individual human lifetimes, it would have seemed like a slow-motion catastrophe. As our own civilization faces potential sea level rise from modern climate change, the lessons of the past become relevant again. Finally, it reminds us that there's still so much to discover about our own history. The oceans cover 70% of Earth's surface, and we've only thoroughly explored a tiny fraction of them. There could be dozens or hundreds of underwater archaeological sites waiting to be found. Each new discovery has the potential to rewrite our understanding of the human story. The 10 lost civilizations we've discussed represent just the beginning of this rediscovery. As technology improves and more resources are devoted to underwater archaeology, we'll undoubtedly find more evidence of the pre-flood world. Each discovery will fill in more pieces of the puzzle and bring us closer to understanding what really happened in humanity's deep past. The Great Flood really happened. The evidence from geology, archaeology, and ancient texts all agree on this. Sea levels rose dramatically as the Ice Age ended, flooding thousands of square miles of coastal land where humans lived. Civilizations that existed in those areas were destroyed or forced to flee inland. The survivors remembered the catastrophe and passed down stories about it that eventually became the flood myths found in cultures around the world. We're now in a position to move beyond myth and discover the reality of these lost civilizations. The technology exists to explore underwater sites that have been inaccessible for thousands of years. The will to question traditional narratives is stronger than ever, and the evidence keeps accumulating that there's far more to our past than we've been taught. These lost civilizations aren't just interesting historical curiosities. They're part of our heritage as humans. Understanding them helps us understand ourselves, where we came from, what we're capable of, and what lessons we can learn from those who came before us. The story of humanity didn't begin 6,000 years ago with Mesopotamia. It goes back much, much further to civilizations that rose and fell before the Great Flood, leaving only fragments, memories for us to piece together thousands of years later.